Good day. Today is Friday, 11th July 2025, and the various conflicts around the world continue. And we have also had a series of increasingly eccentric decisions from the President of the United States concerning his tariff policy. And to follow up on a point that was made to me over a program that he and I have been making together, Alex Christoforou, my colleague and friend, pointed out that for the current administration, tariff policy is now merging with sanctions policy, so that the economic justifications that originally existed for tariffs are now gradually being replaced, in fact not gradually, rapidly being replaced by geopolitical ones. How else, for example, can one interpret the truly strange letter that the President of the United States sent on the 9th of July to the President of Brazil? This letter, which informs Brazil of a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods, begins with criticism of the Brazilian authorities' decision to bring legal proceedings against the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. I knew and dealt with former President Jair Bolsonaro and respected him greatly, as did most other leaders of countries. The way that Brazil has treated former President Bolsonaro, a highly respected leader throughout the world during his term, including by the United States, is an international disgrace. This trial should not be taking place. It is a witch hunt that should end immediately. That is the first paragraph of this letter. Without any preamble or introduction, it goes straight into the question of the Brazilian authorities' decision to bring legal proceedings against former President Bolsonaro. And then the rest of the letter criticizes the Brazilian Supreme Court's decision to authorize certain proceedings against American social media platforms. And then there is another lengthy criticism of Brazil about the way in which Brazil is conducting its trade policy. This part of the letter is particularly strange because it appears to suppose that Brazil is running a trade surplus with the United States, whereas in actual fact it is running an $8 billion deficit. And anyway, all of this confirming the decision to impose 50% tariffs on Brazilian goods exported by Brazil to the United States. So, criticism of investigations and legal proceedings against the former Brazilian president, President Bolsonaro. Indisputably, one would have thought, an internal matter of Brazil's. Whatever one's views about President Bolsonaro and the merits or otherwise of those proceedings. Criticism of actions taken by the Brazilian courts, not by the government of Brazil, to impose restrictions on the publications within Brazil of matters on their social media platforms. Again, one might have many different views about these things. I myself am not someone who approves of courts interfering in this kind of way in the publication of information by social media platforms. Is this really a matter that justifies 50% tariffs? Is it in fact, has it anything in fact to do with tariff policy at all? And then another long tirade about a Brazilian trade surplus with the United States, which does not in fact exist. Now, the first two items, the ones about Bolsonaro and the court actions against these restricting content published in Brazil by American social media platforms, well, those, it seems to me, are clearly political issues. Now, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou correctly said, the original rationale for the tariffs was that they were necessary both as a revenue-raising measure to replace the income tax. That is what President Trump repeatedly says. Whether, of course, it ever turns out that way is another matter. But as I said, the original justification of the tariffs was first as a revenue-raising measure to enable further cuts in direct taxes, income and corporation tax in the United States, and secondly, to provide protection for American industry to facilitate the reindustrialization of the United States, the reversal of the process of deindustrialization that has been taking place. But here we see the President of the United States writing a letter to the President of Brazil, one which is not even delivered to him to the President of Brazil, before it is published in the United States, in the American media. I mean, the level of insult here is extraordinary. Here we have a letter from the President of the United States to the President of Brazil, which touches on neither of those two original rationalizations. And I say rationalizations because, in fact, since Alex and I had that conversation, matters have taken an enormous step further still, one which actually codifies the unity of tariffs and sanctions into American law. And I am referring now to an article, a very interesting article, that has appeared in National Review, a newspaper, or rather magazine, founded by the late William Buckley, one which could be described as the fountainhead in the United States of neocon ideology. Anyway, this article gives a description of the evolution of the bone-crushing sanctions bill being prepared in Congress by Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal. And the title of this article says that the Senate may hand President Trump a new tariff bazooka. Now, the original conception behind this bill, as it was first proposed back in April, was that the United States would impose 500% tariffs on countries that bought Russian energy products, oil, gas, and uranium. By the way, one of the major buyers of Russian uranium is the United States. Just saying. Anyway, according to an article in Politico, which is referenced by this article in National Review, following discussions with the administration, this sanctions bill has been very significantly modified. It now authorizes the president to impose 500% tariffs against countries that import oil, gas, or uranium from Russia, authorizes, no longer mandates. The president has the right to decide whether or not to do this and to carve out exemptions. Countries which oppose, or say they oppose, Russian actions in Ukraine are supposedly exempted from this bill. But then, of course, that begs the question of what exactly do countries need to do to gain this exemption? Do they just say, for example, that they don't agree with what the Russians are doing? Is it just a form of words that is necessary? Of course, we haven't seen the bill itself, so we can't really say. And the bill apparently confirms that it is purely the president's decision what tariffs he imposes against which countries, subject to congressional oversight, the details of which are left unexplained. But then it goes on to say that apparently the 500% tariffs are a ceiling. The president is entitled to impose tariffs against countries that are acting inappropriately at a lower level. So he could impose 1% tariffs if he chose, or 20% tariffs, or 50% tariffs, all the way up to 500% tariffs. As I said, it's a flexible thing. But ultimately, as I said, the decision is the president's, subject to this nebulous idea of congressional oversight. It's not, by the way, clear that as of now, the president himself has agreed to there being any kind of congressional oversight at all. Anyway, that we've had some inklings of over the last couple of days. But National Review adds a fascinating new contribution to the discussion of this bill, because it says that the bill actually provides a legal framework to enable the president to impose tariffs. Now, I have said in previous programs that I and quite a few people have had some degree of skepticism about the president's power to impose tariffs. Revenue-raising measures, according to the Constitution of the United States, are the prerogative, the exclusive prerogative of Congress. The president has been imposing tariffs on various countries in reliance upon the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, claiming that he's imposing these sanctions to respond to some unexplained economic emergency in the United States. There has already been a court ruling against this. The Court of International Trade ruled back in May that this act does not, in fact, grant the president unlimited tariff authority, which is what I have always believed. The issue is now being appealed by the administration and will presumably, and in time, eventually reach the Supreme Court of the United States. But according to National Review, this new act, this purported sanctions bill against Russia, is going to facilitate the president's problems, because as it will be a bill passed by Congress, if the president does indeed decide to impose tariffs against various countries, he can cite the provisions of this bill to do so, provided he says that the reason he's imposing these tariffs is because in some form or other, these countries, the countries that he's imposing the tariffs upon, have some trade connection with Russia. So, what started as a sanctions bill, we are now being told, is evolving into a bill intended to enable the president to bypass Congress and impose tariffs in a way that cannot be challenged any longer in the courts. I have to say, this leaves me completely speechless. Tariffs are an instrument of economic policy. They are a legitimate instrument of economic policy. They are now being merged with sanctions, which are something totally different altogether. From this point on, we will no longer know where US trade policy begins and ends and where US sanctions policy begins and ends, because the two will have become one. Now, does anybody in the United States, do Senators Graham and Blumenthal, does the president himself, do the officials of his administration fully understand what that means? It means that any economic treaty, any trade agreement the United States makes with any country is now subject to the president's overriding power, whenever he so chooses, to set that trade treaty aside and to impose tariffs on that country, in effect, as a kind of form of sanctions. Sanctions not technically against that country, but against a third country, specifically Russia. As I said, the mind reels. It is absolutely extraordinary, but this is apparently how the United States now manages its affairs, its economic policy, its trade policy, its geopolitical reach, all of these things. Meanwhile, the president himself is now apparently telling everybody that he's going to make a statement on the 14th, or rather next Monday, about Russia. He's going to make a big announcement on Monday about Russia. Now, there is huge uncertainty as to what exactly this means. Does this relate to decisions to supply more weapons to Ukraine? In an interview with, I believe, NBC, the president has said that he's prepared to sell weapons to Ukraine, which the Europeans buy. Other reports say that he's about to exercise, for the first time, his drawdown authority to authorize a transfer of a Patriot missile battery to Ukraine, plus perhaps 10 missile interceptors. Already here we have contradictory, inconsistent statements. But anyway, he says that he's going to he is going to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine. What is a defensive weapon as opposed to an offensive weapon is left completely unclear. But anyway, let's walk past that. He says he's going to make a big announcement on Monday about Russia. He said that he is warming to the idea of the sanctions bill that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal are putting together. He says that this bill will leave him fully and completely in control, which, of course, as I've discussed in many programs, properly speaking, he already is, at any rate where sanctions are concerned. Tariffs, of course, is a different matter. As I said, that's open to legal challenge. But sanctions, nobody's really disputed up to now that the president has authority via executive order to impose sanctions. Anyway, never mind. So the president is perhaps hinting that this big announcement on Monday could be one of those things, either sanctions, tariffs, support for Lindsey Graham's and Blumenthal's new sanctions bill, or perhaps it could be an announcement of further weapons deliveries to Ukraine, or perhaps it's both. The president, again, sort of distanced himself from the decision that the Pentagon took the week before to pause deliveries of important types of weapons to Ukraine. I'll return to all of this topic again shortly. But anyway, he's going to make this big announcement on Monday about Russia. The Russians look completely unfazed and, shall we say, unimpressed by any of this. But in the meantime, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, had a meeting in Kuala Lumpur on the fringes of the ASEAN summit with the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And this meeting, completely inconsistently with the mood music that is now coming from the president himself and from the administration, appears, on the surface at least, to have gone reasonably well. Now, I say that the United States, as it has now basically given up on providing us with regular readouts. There is no readout on the State Department's website, as of the time of making of this program, of the discussion between Rubio and Lavrov. There is a readout on the Russian Foreign Ministry's website, and now I will read it. On 10th July, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the sidelines of the annual ASEAN ministerial events in Kuala Lumpur. As a follow-up to agreements reached by the presidents of Russia and the United States, including during their latest telephone conversation on July 3rd, the ministers reviewed all issues on the bilateral agenda and the global situation. They also held a substantive and frank exchange of views on the settlement in Ukraine, the situation in Iran and Syria, as well as a number of other international issues. Now, here I return to the formula that used to be used in Soviet readouts of conversations about signaling disagreements between the parties. The Soviet readouts would, whenever they published the expression full and frank exchange of views or something approaching that, that would signal a straight disagreement, in fact, at times even an argument. This readout uses the words a substantive and frank exchange of views on the settlement in Ukraine, the situation in Iran and Syria, as well as a number of other international issues. The word frank appears there, and it is in the Russian Foreign Ministry's translation, English translation of the readout. So I treat that as confirmation of disagreement, but then it would hardly be otherwise, given all that we otherwise know. Then the Russian readout continues. They reaffirmed mutual commitment to searching for peaceful solutions to conflict situations and resuming Russian-US economic and humanitarian cooperation and unhindered ties between their countries' societies, which could be promoted by the resumption of direct flights. Now, previously, the day before, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, said that the Americans had shown no interest in re-establishing direct flights. This Russian readout suggests that, on the contrary, some sort of progress on this topic is being made. And note that it also talks about resuming Russian-US economic and humanitarian cooperation. The key word there is economic. How is that consistent with the noises coming out of Washington about sanctions, further sanctions, the bone-crushing sanctions being on their way? And then we read they also emphasized the importance of continued efforts to normalize the functioning of bilateral diplomatic missions. Well, we know that this is something that they have had several meetings over, and according to Ryabkov, those discussions also are effectively at a standstill. And then the Russian readout ends. It has been agreed to continue constructive dialogue on a growing number of issues of mutual interest based on mutual respect between the Russian and U.S. foreign policy offices. So there are some points about this readout which suggest continued disagreements and even tension. There is that formula, a substantive and frank exchange of views. But there's also some hints here that the two sides are continuing to make progress in improving their relations. Well, that's the Russians. Lavrov himself has been speaking. I don't yet have, as of the time of this program, making this program, an actual Russian foreign ministry transcript of his words, which were apparently spoken to the media. But we learned this from TASS, and this is a summary from TASS of the things that Lavrov and Rubio discussed. The future of the New START treaty was not discussed at the meeting in Kuala Lumpur. And that is important because, as I said in my previous program, the START treaty, the only existing arms control treaty anywhere in the world limiting the expansion of nuclear arsenals, is now hanging by a thread. If it is not renewed, I believe before the end of this year, then it will expire, and we run the serious risk in that case of an arms race, a nuclear arms race, starting to develop between Russia and the United States, which is, of course, already in a difficult position as China also now moves forward to build up its own nuclear capabilities. But then the TASS summary says, instead, Lavrov and Rubio talked Ukraine, and now it's a direct quote from Ukraine. We discussed Ukraine and we reiterated the position that President Putin has articulated, including during his conversation with President Trump on July 3rd. So, to all appearances, what Lavrov here is saying is that the Russians are standing firm on the things that Putin and the Russians have been repeatedly saying. Their terms remain essentially those outlined by Putin at the meeting of the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, also elaborated in the memorandum that the Russians have presented to the Ukrainians at the last meeting that they had with them in Istanbul. And but this remains the position that the Russians are adopting as set out in the meeting that took place between, the telephone conversation which took place between Trump and Putin over the telephone on the 3rd of July, the one when it seems that Trump exerted big pressure on Putin to agree to some kind of ceasefire, and the one in which it looks as if Putin said that he was not going to agree to that and that Russia would not back down on its terms for ending the conflict. So that's apparently what Lavrov is saying. And of course, as I discussed in another program just a couple of days ago, Lavrov made his own statement about the terms upon which the conflict must end, and he went well beyond what Putin has said. He said that the sanctions must all be lifted, all of the international sanctions must be lifted, the money the assets, the Russian frozen assets, must be handed back to the Russians, I presume, with full repayment of accrued interest. And, well, he made various other points as well, all of them consistent with the previous Russian position. And I should say that the Kremlin at the moment is continuing to insist on this. The Kremlin spokesman, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has said that Moscow is disappointed that the completely clear and consistent signals sent by Moscow are being disregarded. And we will see what he has to say about latest ideas that have been coming out of London following the meeting between Macron and Starmer and the so-called coalition of the willing. We'll come to that shortly. But anyway, the Russians outwardly, or to all appearances, are holding firm to their position. And that is, it seems, what Lavrov said to Rubio. Then we have a very, very strange set of comments from Rubio to the media. And I'm not going to read them in full, but the things that struck me about them, first of all, was the conciliatory language that he used towards Lavrov and to the Russians. Our strategy is to engage all the parties that are involved in finding an outcome to this conflict. We will engage any time that we have an opportunity to do so, like we did today. I echoed what the president said, both the disappointment and frustration at the lack of progress in peace talks or in a path forward. So we'll continue to engage. We shared some ideas and comments, which I'll take back to Washington as early as this evening in terms of calls, and reflected, and perhaps there's something to build on there. So, but it was a frank conversation. It was an important one. We had it, and we talked about some other items as well, unrelated to the war in Ukraine, but that was obviously the first and foremost topic that we discussed. And look, the president's been pretty clear. He's disappointed and frustrated that there's not been more flexibility on the Russian side to bring about an end to this conflict. We hope that can change, and we're going to continue to stay involved where we see opportunities to make a difference. And then he went on to say, I'm not going to characterize our conversation other than to tell you that I expressed what the president said publicly, which is that we feel as if we've dedicated a lot of time and energy to this matter and just not enough progress has been made. We need to see a roadmap moving forward about how this conflict can conclude, and then we shared some ideas about what that might look like. Notice that he does not say who actually presented those ideas. And obviously, I'll take that back to the president here as early as this evening, and hopefully there's something we can build on there. And then there was a lot more about this, and about this not being Donald Trump's war, and about the fact that the administration is engaging with the Senate over the sanctions bill, and we told them that the moment, he says, when it comes to the Russians, we told them that the moment would come where something like this will happen, and we'll continue to express it because that's the reality, that there will be the sanctions bill and all of that. And then he again tried to play down the information, the decision a week ago to stop weapons deliveries to Ukraine. He said that this had been mischaracterized, that it had been that this was the product of a review, that the United States continues to supply weapons to Ukraine, just not perhaps in the same quantity, certain particular categories of weapons. He said that the United States is still urgently trying to find Patriot missiles that it can send to Ukraine, and is leaning on its European allies to send Patriot missiles to Ukraine and all of that. But the thing that has attracted some attention and which has been of interest to people is this talk that, yes, some kind of ideas, thoughts were exchanged, and maybe it might be possible to build on those and to see a way forward, and that what the United States needs is a roadmap taking the process towards some kind of conclusion. Now, many people have interpreted these words of Rubio's to mean that the Russians came with some kind of proposal with them and which Lavrov provided to Rubio at this meeting. Well, of course, that is possible, but I have to say that does, it seem to me, go somewhat beyond Rubio's actual words. It looks more like there was some kind of a conversation, and as perhaps occasionally happens, the two sides bounced ideas off each other, and some of those ideas seemed to take the process forward, and that each side intends to consult with its respective government. I mean, that seems to me a fairer description of what Rubio has said. Anyway, Lavrov didn't say anything about this, but curiously, Rubio and Lavrov, after their first meeting, which lasted about an hour, had a further brief meeting, a second brief meeting, in which it should be said they both looked quite cheerful. And Lavrov was asked about what might be coming and what the Russian proposals were. And apparently Lavrov responded, there are matters that cannot be commented upon. And he spoke about wait for big surprises, very typical of Lavrov to tease the media in that way. And apparently there's some suggestions that Rubio winked at Lavrov. Anyway, it's all very nebulous and very unclear and very uncertain. Now, there is one thing that did stand out to me when I read Rubio's words, which is that the word ceasefire nowhere appears in any of them. It looks as if there is no mention, well, there was no mention of ceasefire. Instead, there's talk about a plan, a roadmap towards agreeing some kind of peace settlement. I mean, might it be that the Americans, or at least someone in the United States, I'm not saying this is Trump himself necessarily, has come to the view that trying to get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire, is a hopeless task, but that it may be possible for the Americans and the Russians directly to work together on working out some kind of roadmap. I mean, that's not impossible. I don't want to put too much weight on any of this. To be quite frank, I'm not sure that anything substantive was agreed or discussed at all. It just seems to me that what Rubio is saying is that the Russians and the Americans, whatever happens next week, are going to continue to talk to each other. The period under Biden, when they didn't talk, is now being put to one side, and that they're going to continue to talk, and maybe Ukraine and the Ukraine issue would be sidelined in some way. Trump will get his sanctions bill, which will enable him to impose his tariffs. He's going to send some dribbles of weapons to Ukraine, and some kind of discussions between the Russians and the Americans can nonetheless take place, even as that topic, the topic of Ukraine, is sidelined. Maybe that's what's happening. I mean, I don't know. Perhaps we will find out next week. There has to be the other possibility that this is all smoke and mirrors. We saw that the negotiations between Iran and the United States, not that just different in some respects to the negotiations that are taking place between Russia and the United States, ended in no kind of outcome. Instead, the United States and Israel attacked Iran over the course of those very same negotiations. So, as I said, as at this moment in time, it's impossible to make any conclusions at all as to what is actually taking place. It is interesting that Lavrov and Rubio do seem to have established some kind of, well, understanding and mutual respect with each other. It's clear that they still disagree. There's no hint here of the Russians having shifted their position in any way. Perhaps the Americans discussed working on a roadmap towards a peace in Ukraine with the Russians, separately from the question of a ceasefire. One can come up with any possibility that one wishes. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, Ray McGovern, who, as I've said many times, is he was for many years one of the top analysts, if not the top analyst, within the intelligence community in the United States on Soviet and Russian matters. One of the key members, I believe one of the founding members of BRICS. Anyway, he has commented that, his take from this discussion is that it is indeed the case that the Americans and the Russians are still working to explore some kind of development of their relations and have agreed between them to try to find some kind of way to put the question of Ukraine to one side. In that case, all the noises from Washington, the decisions, the support for the sanctions bill, the new rather unimpressive weapons deliveries to Ukraine, all of that is all smoke and mirrors. And Ray McGovern could very, very well be right, and it would make complete sense of everything that we have read. But with this administration, one has to wonder, and it seems to me, and this is my own personal take, that it's equally plausible, that it's the opposite, that this meeting in Kuala Lumpur is smoke and mirrors, and that it is in fact the sanctions and the commitment to further arms deliveries, which is what is really coming. Now, I devoted perhaps far too much time to a discussion of this meeting. Perhaps it will turn out to be an important meeting, or perhaps not. We simply don't know. Now, Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, the former president and prime minister, as I discussed a short while ago on his Telegram channel, said that it's pointless trying to develop policy based on what Donald Trump says from one day to the next. Trump just changes position. He says one thing one day, something completely different the next day. No one can base anything upon this. The only thing that the Russians can do is press on with the war, because that's the only way to deal with this kind of approach. And, it seems that other parties around the world are coming to the identical conclusion. There is an article, I think it's in Politico, at least one of the American magazines, that says that the Europeans have no confidence that Donald Trump is going to stick to any kind of policy with respect to Ukraine. He might today be appearing to take a stronger anti-Russian, more pro-Ukrainian line, but he might reverse course next week and then again reverse it the week after. He could decide from one day to the next either to keep troops in, American troops, to keep the American troops in Europe or to pull them out. It is impossible anymore to base policy, to construct policy by reading the words of the US president. And I have to say that I agree. I've basically given up the exercise. It changes too often. Larry Johnson on Sonar 21 has made this same point. And the fundamental difficulty that everybody confronts is that it's impossible to escape the sense of an insecure president, insecure in himself, who is terrified of appearing weak and therefore makes decisions which undermine whatever policy he might have. So, as I discussed in my program yesterday, he's now informed about the critical state of US weapons inventories. Despite his protestations, he clearly approves a pause on weapons deliveries to Ukraine to give time for those weapons inventories to be restocked. He then encounters some criticism for making that decision. He then immediately reverses course. He authorizes supply of more weapons deliveries. The Pentagon, I notice, has preserved a kind of stony silence about all of this. They've issued a statement saying that, of course, they will do what the president says, they will supply weapons, but there's been no rush to comment from Hegseth or Colby or Feinberg or any of the people who made this decision. And in fact, I've also read another article which says that the Ukrainians are finding it very difficult now to speak to top officials in the Pentagon. Umerov, the current Ukrainian defense minister, has been trying for some months to set up a meeting, or at least a telephone call with Pete Hegseth, and has been unable to do so. The Pentagon is becoming increasingly exasperated as they see their weapons inventories dwindle. They're clearly unhappy, but for the moment at least, they have to comply with this constant change and erratic and unstable course that the president himself is taking. And that is leading to eccentric outcomes, like the bizarre outcome, which I discussed at the start of the program, of basically merging US economic and sanctions policy into one, which is what we now have with the way in which tariffs are now being used as an instrument of sanctions. Anyway, there we go. Let's turn to what's now actually taking place in Ukraine. I should say that Zelensky himself has some kind of a he seems to be somewhat lifted by the latest words from Washington. He's hoping or expecting that he's going to get more weapons deliveries from the West. He's talking about this. He has in effect confirmed publicly that he is indeed intending to send Umerov to Washington as Ukraine's ambassador, which really does call into question whether Umerov himself is going to continue as chief negotiator. It looks as if Umerov and Zelensky still have no serious intention of engaging in any sort of follow-up meeting with the Russians in Istanbul. The Turks and the Russians have asked the Ukrainians to come back with further explanations of what they intend to do. And, well, the Ukrainians have not done so. They've not responded in any detail to the Russian memorandum. They continue to take a completely hard line on this. So, that's the Ukrainians. They feel that the mood, the dial in Washington is once again shifting back in their favour. Just saying. Meanwhile, Starmer and Macron have had their meeting in London. And, of course, there was a further meeting afterwards of the Coalition of the Willing. And the meeting actually was completely bizarre. Macron again refloated the idea that French troops might be sent to Ukraine. This elicited a very sharp response from the Russians. They again repeated that this is for them an immovable red line. They Peskov asked why this is simply not being attended to. And the Russians went further and said that as far as they are concerned, they will not tolerate the presence of NATO troops close to their borders on Ukrainian soil. There is, as it happens, no consensus still anywhere in Europe on the deployment of peacekeepers or anything of that kind to Ukrainian territory. And supposedly all of the talk again is about establishing some kind of no-fly zone in western Ukraine if the Russians agree to a ceasefire. But the Russians are not agreeing to a ceasefire, and these plans and proposals that are coming up from Macron and Starmer are not impressing them. So I can't imagine that any of this is going to happen. And I suspect that Starmer and Macron quietly understand that themselves. All their hopes now appear to rest on the hope that Trump is going to impose these massive sanctions. And as I've discussed in many programs, for the Europeans now, the decision to go ahead with sanctions, for the Americans to go ahead with sanctions, has now become an end in itself. It's become more important than what the effect on Russia actually is. Because getting the United States to impose sanctions, more sanctions on Russia, is in a way a mechanism to commit the United States and Donald Trump to the continuation, the indefinite continuation of Project Ukraine. And that is the European priority. And it again remains a puzzle that Donald Trump himself and the various people in his administration don't understand it. Anyway, the Europeans seem to be all hoping and counting on this sanctions announcement next week. As I said, the Russians, for the moment, seem to be unimpressed by this and intend to call the bluff on it. Anyway, let's see what happens next week. Now, Macron and Starmer also agreed that they would sort of, in some way, coordinate use of their nuclear weapons deterrence in a future confrontation with Russia. This makes really extraordinarily little sense, given that one assumed that this was already the case, just to say. I mean, I don't know how this adds to arrangements within NATO that presumably already exist. If it's an intention, the purpose behind it is to coordinate nuclear weapons policy independently of the United States, which is, of course, still the foremost nuclear power in NATO by far, then this British-French announcement is an anti-American, not an anti-Russian measure. But to be completely frank, I don't really believe that this is anything more than further empty words. I don't think that Starmer or Macron have any serious policies, and I don't think that one should look to them for such policies. Just saying. Anyway, there it is. That's the empty coalition of the willing. The entire negotiation that is taking place is between the Americans and the Russians, to the extent that there is a negotiation. Whether Rubio and Lavrov made any progress with each other, I frankly strongly doubt, but we will get some clarity, some further clarity next week. Now, in the meantime, what has been going on in the war? Well, last night we had another massive Russian combined drone and missile strike on Kiev. And again, the Ukrainians are claiming that they shot down most of the drones. I don't believe them, by the way. And that they shot down most of the missiles. I don't believe them. I don't believe them about that either. The pictures, the film from Kiev is absolutely devastating. We see huge columns of black smoke rising from Kiev's western suburbs. Apparently, significant amount of damage was done. And, well, I don't yet know what the Russians were striking at in Kiev, but we see that the Russian missile and drone offensive continues relentlessly. It continues to pound the Ukrainians every night now. And the Ukrainians, my own sense, is that their air defense has, to all intents and purposes now, completely collapsed. Meanwhile, the Russian offensive continues to grind forward relentlessly on the actual battlefronts. And again, I'm only going to provide the slightest of commentaries on this channel. The Russians apparently have made significant progress towards Liman in the Slavyansk area. Probably an attack on Liman itself is on the horizon. They have also apparently made significant further progress in a village called Yablukov. It's more like a small town, Yablunkov, south of Konstantinovka, the area where one gets the sense that a significant number of Ukrainian troops are encircled. There are reports that the situation for the Ukrainians northeast of Pakrovsk is deteriorating by the hour, and there are now growing numbers of messages and commentaries coming out from the relevant Ukrainian channels that speak of an accelerating crisis northeast of Pakrovsk, and which contain more than a hint of panic about them. The Russians continue to advance westwards from in the western Donetsk area. From what I can see, they're now working towards encircling the important logistical center and village called Novopavlivka, which is in Dnipropetrovsk region, and which they have now bypassed from the south and which they're fairly close to from the east and north. And apparently this is a well-fortified position, but it does look as if the first steps have been taken to encircle it as well. Now, I've had a number of emails about the situation in Sumy region and about what is really going on in Sumy region, where the Russians made significant advances earlier this summer. And again, there are lots of reports that the Russians have either completely cleared or mostly cleared the village of Yunakovka in Sumy region, but it's been suggested that the offensive there, the Russian offensive there, is stagnating. Now, with respect to that, I would just remind people of that very strange commentary, maybe it wasn't so strange commentary, that appeared in TASS about a week ago that I covered in one of my programs, which said that Ukrainian reports about what's going on in Sumy are mostly fiction. The Ukrainians claim that there are 50,000 Russian troops in Sumy region. It is only a fraction of that number. That the Ukrainians claimed that they were heavily outnumbered in Sumy region. The reality was, if anything, the opposite. That the Ukrainians had redeployed many of their best forces to Sumy region because they were so nervous of a Russian breakthrough there, which might open the way to Kiev. And that pretty much all the reports about successful Ukrainian counterattacks in Sumy region were untrue. And in fact, a couple of days ago, there was a lot of reports about major Ukrainian counterattack in Sumy region that was supposed to recapture Sumy region and lead to the Ukrainian re-entry into Belgorod and Kursk regions. This all came from Syrskyi, who gave assurances to Zelensky that that was the plan. Well, of course, none of that has happened. As far as I can see, there were Ukrainian counterattacks, but they have stopped. Now, my overall sense of what the Russians are doing, not just in Sumy region, but in Kharkiv region, everywhere on the front lines, is that at this stage in their offensive, they're stretching the Ukrainians by attacking everywhere, continuously and all the time. And that is obliging the Ukrainians to shuffle their forces from one place to another to prevent critical gaps appearing along this impossibly long conflict line. And what that means is that when an operational crisis emerges in one region, because the Ukrainians have been obliged to shift their forces to one particular place, then the Russians exploit it. The Ukrainians then rush whatever troops they can spare back, but leave another part of the front line exposed, and then the Russians take advantage by advancing in that place too. And as a result, the Ukrainian lines are being stretched and overextended all the time, and that the Russians plan to continue this approach until eventually, as I said, the Ukrainian forces start to flag and we start to see a breakdown. It is an intensification of the policy of aggressive attrition, which I described the Russians adopting after the fall of Avdiivka last year. It was last year when the Russians first began to speak of themselves as having gone over to the offensive. And over the last couple of months, we have seen that offensive continuously gain strength and power, but these aggressive attrition tactics continue in the way that I've just said. And we can see how this plays out in Sumy region. So the Russians advanced into Sumy region, the Ukrainians rushed troops to hold back the Russians in Sumy region. They took them from Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. That allowed the Russians to achieve a major breakthrough in Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, capturing a whole cluster of places between Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk and advancing northeast of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians then rushed troops back to Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. That allowed the Russians to resume the advance in Sumy region. It looked a few weeks ago as if the Russians might threaten the city of Sumy itself, the regional center, as Group of Forces North calls it. The Ukrainians, Syrsky and Zelensky, then rushed troops back to Sumy region, and the Russian advance as a result elsewhere, especially in the critical area of Pokrovsk, but also in western Donetsk, has begun to accelerate. And we're probably going to continue to see this play out this way for several weeks or months further. It's important to stress that even as this goes on, the Russians continue to advance. And the advance in western Donbass towards the Dnieper in particular is, contrary to what many say, quite rapid now. If you look at the distance the Russians have gone from Avdiivka and Krasnogorovka, which were outlying suburbs of the city of Donetsk, and look to where they are now, then you can see that over the course of the last year, and contrary to what many are claiming, there has been quite a significant advance with substantial and important places like Selidovo, Kurakhovo, Ugleda, and others captured. So that, I think, is what the Russians are doing, and they're going to continue to do it because it is working out well for them. And of course, if, as I'm gradually coming round to think, Western assessments of Russian casualties are not just inflated, but greatly inflated, then one can see why. I remember that Marat Khairulin, the best and most astute of all Russian military commentators, made this very point in commentary that he published roughly a year ago. He said that it makes absolutely no sense for the Russians to change an approach in the war that is actually and successfully working, and that it is important for them, on the contrary, to stick to their existing plan rather than to run off and launch dramatic operations which might appear impressive, but which will not in the end deliver the results that people expect it to. So that's my own sense of where we are. And as I said, in reality and in fact, the Russian advances continue and the Ukrainian military gets increasingly threadbare, and the United States is now facing, as I've discussed in recent programs, a critical resource crisis. So there it is. Now, there are a few further things I want to say before I wrap up. Briefly, there are some suggestions that one of the things that the Europeans might be thinking of doing is to try to impose some kind of blockade of the Russians in the Baltic Sea. As I discussed in a program I made about a week ago, the Russian Navy is now starting to escort Russian merchant ships, or at least merchant ships that anchor in Russian ports through the Baltic. This is visibly happened, and more likely than not, it will happen more and more. If there's going to be a naval blockade, the West is actually going to have to tangle with Russian warships. on the high seas, and that is an incredibly dangerous game. Now, looking at the pattern of Russian exports, I've been looking at where the major ports for Russian oil exports are located. And indeed, the largest cluster of Russian oil terminals is in the Baltic area, around 15 oil terminals in total. But there is an almost equal number of oil terminals around the Black Sea, and there is no mechanism, as far as I know, to interrupt that traffic. There are no Western navies that could interfere with Russian shipping in the Black Sea. It is inconceivable that Erdogan would seek to do that, and I cannot imagine that he would close the straits either, the Dardanelles. So Russian oil could continue to be exported through the Dardanelles, through the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, and via the Suez Canal, which is of course controlled by Egypt, which is a country friendly to Russia and now a member of the BRICS. And the Russians do have two oil terminals in the Arctic and 8 oil terminals in the Far East. So yes, if the Baltic were entirely closed to Russian shipping, then a significant part of Russian shipping would be affected. I'm guessing around a quarter of oil deliveries currently pass through the Baltic, perhaps a bit more, but there are certainly other routes through which oil could be exported, and though obviously there would have to be work done to expand the terminals in the Far East and in the Black Sea and possibly even in the Arctic, I have no doubt at all that it can be done. And building oil terminals is not such an enormously complex industrial and construction task as some think. And of course, in the meantime, if the Baltic were indeed closed to Russian shipping, which I don't myself believe is going to happen, well, the effect inevitably would be an increase in the price of oil. Just saying. So that's, I think, where we are with this conflict. Huge uncertainty, confusion on the part of the president in the United States. It's very difficult to work out what Donald Trump himself is going to do. I noticed that the State Department, his spokesman, is once again saying that the decision rests entirely with the president, which is an interesting form of words. In some ways it flatters him because it makes it appear that he is the key decision maker. But if anything goes wrong, it also, in a way, shifts the blame in advance upon him. It is he who decides, so it is he who must take the blame if anything miscarries, if anything goes wrong. I wonder whether Donald Trump fully understands this. In my program yesterday, by the way, I said that it looked as if the Russians are now starting to take reprisals against Ukrainian intelligence officers involved in the secret war against Russia. I mentioned the assassination of Lieutenant Colonel Voinovich yesterday. I've subsequently learned that at least one other Ukrainian lieutenant colonel was also assassinated in Kiev, and he apparently was concerned more with the conscription process, with the recruitment of Ukrainian troops. And of course the Russians have been targeting the recruitment centres across Ukraine in many of their recent drone and missile strikes. And allegedly, they've been getting information from Ukrainian sources as to where many of these recruitment centres are located. I wonder whether all of these attacks, the attacks on the recruitment centres, the assassinations in Kiev, might not be connected. It does, I have to say, increasingly look to me as if the Russians are taking reprisals, that they are responding to the sabotage and assassination war that the Ukrainians have been waging inside Russia itself. I suspect that this is going to escalate over the next few weeks and months, now that it looks as if that decision has been made. As I said in my programme yesterday, all that remains to be seen is whether the Russian reprisals start to affect people higher up the political command chain in Ukraine itself. Anyway, this is where I end my programme today. No doubt we'll be getting more information over the next 24 hours. And of course, it does look as if Monday is going to be an interesting and clarifying day. But in the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you all well, to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.